In the year 66, the people of Judea rebelled against the power of Rome. In a war that lasted 4 years, the inhabitants of the small Middle Eastern country tried to regain their freedom. Thanks to the surviving work of one of the participants in the revolt, we have the opportunity to reconstruct a detailed picture of the events that took place in Judea. How did the Jewish war begin? The reign of Herod the First Great brought a serious division in the Jewish society. He reigned with the support of the Romans, having massacred the last representatives of the Hasmonean dynasty and crushed the opposition by force. But he also pushed the boundaries of his kingdom, rebuilt and decorated the temple in Jerusalem, built magnificent palaces, attracted engineers, craftsmen, and military men to his court, and patronized the arts. At the same time, his subjects hated Herod and repeatedly revolted against him. His power in the country was held solely by the force of foreign mercenaries. The money for the monumental buildings was obtained through the ruthless exploitation of the landless peasantry. Fleeing from tax oppression, the masses of the common people fled into the desert or became brigands. When Herod died, Emperor Augustus divided the king's possessions among his 3 sons. The eldest Archelaus received Judea, Idumea, and Samaria. The middle Herod Antipas received Galilee and Perea, and the youngest Herod Philippus received Batanea, Galantes, Trachonitis, and Gorin. No one inherited Herod's royal title. His sons had to settle for the lower ranks of tetrarchs. Herod's children did not inherit their father's statesmanship, but were equally cruel. In 6 Augustus removed and exiled Archelaus from power, and turned his dominions into a province under prefects. After Philip's death in 33, his possessions were also included in the province. In 37, the flighty Emperor Caligula restored the kingdom of Judea, of which he appointed his buddy Agrippa, Herod's grandson, as ruler. Caligula added the tetrarchy of his uncle Herod Antipas. Agrippa proved himself a surprisingly competent ruler, but his rule proved to be very short-lived. He was poisoned by the Syrian governor Gaius Bibius Marsus. His son Agrippa II received only the lands of the former tetrarchy of Philip. Emperor Claudius turned the rest of the territories into a province governed by procurators appointed by the emperor. The opposition to Herod and his successors was mainly religious. The main critics of the ruling regime were the Pharisees. Pharisees sought to establish for themselves and their followers stricter norms of behavior than it was prescribed by the official religion. They stood for strict obedience to the law, carefully studied the sacred texts, had conservative beliefs, led a righteous life, and enjoyed great influence in the assemblies as teachers of the law and judges. The adherents of this doctrine were mainly members of the middle class, priests, scribes, but also a large part of both the Jerusalem Sanhedrin and the temple priesthood. While the Pharisees were in moderate opposition to the authorities and remained part of the political establishment, the Zealots, who had emerged from their midst, took a much more radical and active position. Like the Pharisees, the Zealots also aspired to a righteous way of life, but connected it with the struggle for the liberation of their country from the power of foreigners, by whom they first understood Herod and his family, and then the Romans. The Zealots taught that only the Messiah, a king from the line of David sent to help the believers, could rule the country. The Messiah must defeat the enemies of Israel and establish a kingdom of justice, which the Zealots understood as property equality. These ideas attracted masses of followers from among the common people. The transformation of Judea into a Roman province greatly aggravated and exacerbated the previously existing contradictions in the country. The Pharisees took a moderate position in this situation, believing that the Jews were unable to fight against Rome, and therefore should negotiate with each other, bargaining for the maximum possible concessions. Compared to the radicals among their own peers, the Pharisees considered the Roman power to be the lesser evil for themselves, and that is why many of them turned out to be defectors at the beginning of the revolt. The Zealots, on the other hand, were convinced of the necessity of armed resistance to the invaders, no matter how small the chances of success might seem. In anticipation of the Messiah, they urged the people to disobey the authorities and initiated riots that sometimes involved thousands of people. In 6 Judas the Galilean seized with his supporters the royal arsenal at Sepphoris and then called for evasion of the Roman census. The revolt was put down and Judas himself was killed, but others soon came after him. In 44, a certain Theudas called his followers into the wilderness, assuring them that with words he would make the waters of the Jordan part. The procurator Cuspis Fad sent against Theudas horsemen, who cut off his head, and his supporters scattered. In the reign of Antony Felix appeared a certain false prophet from Egypt, who gathered 4,000 followers. With them he camped on the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem. This unrest was also suppressed by the Romans by force, and the instigator managed to escape. 400 people were killed, and 200 were captured. The most fanatical of the Zealots constituted a special group of Sicarii. Without a clear political program, Sicarii with weapons in their hands attacked the Romans, representatives of the provincial administration, officials and soldiers, as well as their allies among local residents. While the Zealots conducted their activities quite openly, the Sicarii carried out their attacks secretly, hiding their weapons under their clothes. For this reason, they inspired even more fear in their opponents. In their ranks there were people of all kinds, from ideological revolutionaries and religious fanatics to real brigands who lived by robbing their tribesmen. The common people often favored the terrorists, considering them the defenders of the oppressed. The immediate cause, which provoked an explosion of general indignation, was the actions of the provincial procurator Hessius Florus. He owed his appointment to his wife Cleopatra, who was on friendly terms with Empress Poppaea. Florus saw his appointment as a way to quickly make a fortune and therefore did not shy away from any extortion. He traded judicial verdicts, taxed the population of the province of unaffordable levies, robbed both the public domain and the property of private individuals. In 65 the Jews complained about Florus' actions to the Syrian governor Cestius Gallus, but this complaint had no effect. In the spring of 66 Florus intervened in a conflict between the Hellenized and Jewish populations of Caesarea. The Jews had a synagogue in the city located on a plot of land owned by the Greeks. Their repeated attempts to acquire the lot were unsuccessful. For a bribe, Florus promised to settle the dispute in favor of the Jews. However, when he received the money, he avoided resolving the conflict and even arrested a delegation of prominent Jerusalem Jews who came to demand that he fulfill his promise. These actions displeased Florus among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Shortly after these events, Florus himself arrived in Jerusalem on business. Also on behalf of the emperor he demanded from the temple priesthood to give him 17 talents from the temple treasury. This demand offended the religious feelings of the Jews and was rejected with indignation. Crowds in the streets of Jerusalem reviled the name of the procurator and called for deliverance from his tyranny. The city authorities were unable to restore order. Then the enraged Florus ordered his soldiers to attack the inhabitants of the city with weapons in their hands. During his terrible pogrom 600 people were killed. The Jews soon came to their senses and began to resist the soldiers vigorously. A real battle broke out in the streets of the city. The townspeople climbed to the roofs of their houses and from there pelted the soldiers with stones. Convinced that he did not have sufficient forces to put down the rebellion, Florus preferred to leave the city, placing the responsibility for restoring order in the hands of the city authorities. From Caesarea he wrote a letter to Cassius Gallus informing him of the Jews' defection from Rome. When King Agrippa II arrived in Jerusalem at the end of May or the beginning of June, he tried unsuccessfully to persuade the people to obey the authorities. Together with him, many of the aristocracy, who did not want to participate in the revolt, left the city. Power over the city passed into the hands of the revolutionary government. At the suggestion of Eleazar, son of the high priest Ananias, one of the leaders of the rebellion, the daily sacrifice for the health of the emperor was cancelled in the temple in Jerusalem. This move, tantamount to an official declaration of war, split the city's ruling class irrevocably. The Peace Party, remaining in Jerusalem, which included the Jerusalem priesthood and part of the aristocracy, realizing that events were out of their control, appealed to King Agrippa for military assistance. With the help of horsemen sent by the king, they captured the upper city with Herod's palace and the noblemen's quarters in early August. The rebels at this time controlled the lower city and access to the Temple Mount. Fierce street battles ensued between the two sides. The soldiers outnumbered the rebels in strength and training, but they were far more numerous and determined. In addition, masses of people from the countryside were constantly coming to their aid. Outnumbered, Agrippa's soldiers began to retreat and took refuge behind the walls of Herod's palace. The rebels captured the upper city and set fire to the palaces of Ananias, the high priest, and Berenice, Agrippa's sister. They managed to seize the Tower of Antony adjacent to the temple and to break the garrison holding it. Having lost all hope of victory, Agrippa's soldiers agreed to surrender Herod's palace to them on condition that they be allowed to retreat freely. The rebels burned the palace, and killed the high priest Ananias and other Jerusalem nobles found there. The Romans, to whom the terms of surrender did not apply, locked themselves in the three towers of the citadel and for some time held their defenses there. Then they agreed to surrender also on the terms of free exit from the city. When the soldiers laid down their arms, the Jews attacked them and killed every last one of them. The leader of the revolutionary government that seized power in Jerusalem in the summer of 66 was Eleazar, the son of the high priest Ananias, who had been killed by the extremists. His supporters belonged mainly to the aristocratic party, or rather to that part of it which favored rebellion and the continuation of the struggle. Now, after the defeat of the Peace Party, the hitherto wavering moderates, including the Pharisees and the temple priesthood, also joined him. During the street battles with Agrippa's soldiers and their supporters, the Sicarii radicals who came to their aid gained wide popularity and support. Their leader was Menahem, the son of Judah the Galilean, who had led the anti-Roman revolt 6 decades earlier. The Sicarii were excellent fighters whose fanaticism boosted the morale of the rest of the rebellion. It was Menachem who led the attack on the royal palace. After the victory, his authority in the city grew enormously, and this displeased the aristocrats, who did not want to allow radicals to lead the revolt. Eleazar and his supporters decided to deal their opponents a surprise blow. The attack was carefully planned and carried out during a service in the temple. Almost all the Sicarii who were there, including Menahem his commanders, were taken by surprise and killed. Only a few of them managed to escape to the fortress of Masada where their core legionists were located. In 66, Cestius Gallus, governor of Syria, completed the necessary preparations for the march on Jerusalem, which was the main focus and political center of the revolt. As they advanced through Galilee, the Roman armies ruthlessly ravaged and burned the settlements, and killed the inhabitants who had not had time to flee. Soon Cestius set up camp near Jerusalem. Here began the first battles with the rebels. Contrary to the expectations of the commander, the siege of the city was held with great difficulty. Because of the actions of guerrilla groups on the paths of communication, Romans suffered significant losses in people and supplies. Cestius camped on Mount Scopus in the northeast of Jerusalem. For several days he stood still, hoping that the rebels would take the first steps toward reconciliation. Within the city, internecine squabbling continued over whether to continue the war. Some of the nobles at this time began a correspondence with the Roman commander, promising him to open the gates of the city. When the rebels learned of these negotiations, they threw the traitors off the walls. Finally, the Romans went in for the assault. Through the unfinished walls in the northern part of the city, they managed to break into the new city and turn it to ashes. Then, however, their advance was shattered by the strong fortifications surrounding the Temple Mount. An attempt to storm the northern part of the fortifications, despite the courage of the Roman soldiers, was repulsed by the defenders of the city. Having come to the conclusion that the forces at his disposal are not enough to take possession of such a powerful fortress, Cestius decided to retreat. Rebels pursued the Romans, throwing stones at the column of troops and intercepting retired soldiers. Near Beth Horon, the Roman army was surrounded and only with heavy losses, abandoning supplies, escaped. This success encouraged the rebels and contributed to the further expansion of the territory covered by the revolt. Not only in Judea itself, but also in the cities of the neighboring provinces, bloody clashes broke out between the Hellenized population and the Jews. In those cities where the majority of the population was of Jewish origin, masses of their opponents were killed. Most of the eastern provinces fell into chaos, which was exacerbated by the unexpected death of Cestius Gall.